life in the spotlight to one side for a moment, it must be pretty easy being a Hollywood director. No matter what cinematic sins you've committed in your career, so long as you can prove to a studio that you've got some sort of track record in making the money, they'll give you another go behind the camera. As such, Hollywood is currently littered with big-name directors still getting work for no other reason than they managed to make a few box office successes in an entirely different decade. Some are just on a bad run, some haven't managed to make anything relevant for nearly 30 years, but they're all currently hogging a chair that could be given to a younger, fresher, hungrier filmmaker. I'm Adam from Whatculture.com, and these are 10 great directors who haven't made anything good for years. Number 10. Guillermo del Toro. A shining monument to what Hollywood will do to anyone with an ounce of originality and distinction, Guillermo del Toro has gone from being one of the most visually astounding filmmakers in the world to merely the first person a studio calls when the phrase spin-off line of toys gets used. Instead of continuing to make visually astonishing cinema, his career has become one executive producer credit after another, and he's been in charge of making sure that the likes of Puss in Boots, Kung Fu Panda, and Rise of the Guardians have the visual edge over the other dearth of big-budget animations. His next outing, though, The Shape of Water, apparently has a sex scene between a woman and a fish, so maybe a return to form's on the cards. Number 9. Guy Ritchie. It seems almost impossible to think now, but Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels was Guy Ritchie's very first ever shot in a director's chair. Impossible to think because he's been scrambling around for 20 years now, desperately trying to remember how to make a good film. After 2000 Snatch suggested to the world that he was far from a one-hit wonder, his every film since has been another misguided attempt to either try something new or recapture the same formula. 2002 Swept Away, a romantic comedy where he directed his then-wife Madonna in a box office disaster, remains something he's probably still yet to fully recover from. Rock'n'Roller and Revolver, whilst both being films that looked tailor-made for him to return to his filmmaking roots, and both said Guy Ritchie is back to his best on the poster, were critical disasters. 2015's Man from U.N.C.L.E. was hopeless, and the less we say about the woeful King Arthur, the better. Number 8. John Singleton. 1991's Boys in the Hood is about as close to a perfect portrayal of life in the Los Angeles gang scene as it's possible to get. It was unflinchingly honest, deeply personal, and showed a mainstream American audience a side to life in the country that they were largely in denial about. Since then, his career has been a long and depressing parade of bad project after bad project. His immediate follow-ups, Rosewood, Higher Learning, and Poetic Justice, attempted to hit the same nerves as Boys in the Hood, but both their stories and their presentation fell woefully short. Singleton now even holds the dubious honour of being responsible for the worst film in the entire Fast and Furious franchise, and takes almost as much blame as Samuel L. Jackson, but not quite, for the unbelievably bad Shaft remake. His only saving grace since 1991 has been Abduction, a film so widely panned by critics that it's mercifully kept Taylor Lautner from getting any major roles since. Number 7. Francis Ford Coppola. Such has been the contrast and impact between Franny Coppola's early work and contemporary career that most people don't even realise he's still making films. Well, he is, and they're terrible. Recently, he directed, produced, and wrote Twixt, a horror thriller starring Val Kilmer and Ellie Fanning, which was an exploration of the dream world merging with the waking world that was labelled in some quarters as frankly unwatchable. The popularisation of the term modern-day Coppola, because it's simply too upsetting for film lovers to have to use the same name for the man who directed Apocalypse Now and referring to this shower of shit, shows how bad the last 35 years have been for him. His winery's flourishing though, apparently, so, good for him. Number 6. Cameron Crowe. If there's ever been an example of how making one bad film can undo all the great work you've done in the past, it's Cameron Crowe. Crowe broke onto the scene in 1996 when he and Tom Cruise tore up the rulebook on romantic comedies and came up with one of the most original and honest examples of the genre ever seen. Almost Famous provided a charming balance of nostalgia and wide-eyed teenage fantasy that's yet to be repeated, and even Vanilla Sky, which divided audiences and critics, has started to grow in prominence over time. In 2005, though, Crowe penned Elizabethtown, a story of a man who had it all, loses it, but then meets Hollywood's favourite quirky generic female lead, a manic pixie dream girl. Somewhere between Jerry Maguire and Garden State, without the charm or originality of either, Crowe's career has since consisted of a music video, 2 bad documentaries, and We Bought a Zoo, a film so deliberately sweet audiences probably left the screen a few pounds fatter and with a gritty lining on their teeth. Number 5. Tim Burton. While most directors in this list are guilty of making a succession of bad films, Burton's crime is that he's used the same filmmaking style since 1985, and it's now worn painfully thin. His distinctive and gothic-looking visual approach led to him producing some of the most stunning-looking films of the late 80s and 90s, but he's failed spectacularly to update any of this in the years since. Sweeney Todd, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Alice in Wonderland, Dark Shadows, All were big budget and visually noisy without ever managing to tell their story in a way even remotely engaging to audiences. His continued weird obsession with Johnny Depp, as well as his former wife Helena Bonham Carter, gave all of his outings in the 2000s a stale and stagnant feel. The impression of just paying to watch a group of friends mess about with a story you already knew being the only thing audiences could take from his films. Number 4. Joel Schumacher. Depending on how romantically you remember that particular period in cinema, Joel Schumacher is either to thank or to blame for the Brat Pack. St. Elmo's Fire and the Lost Boys might have helped launch the careers of a whole new generation of young actors, but they were also some of the finest films to be released in the 1980s. This moved Schumacher further up the pecking order for Hollywood's most prestigious gigs, and he picked up a number of decent films before directing Batman Forever. Then, Batman and Robin. After that, and presumably getting sick of reading critics calling him names, he more or less gave up, and his career since has been a handful of dark dramas and thrillers, one even going straight to DVD. It would be easy to write Schumacher off as a has-been who's beyond all hope for a comeback, but his direction of 2 House of Cards episodes shows that there's still a solid director in there deep down. Number 3. Spike Lee. In 1989, Spike Lee should have won the Best Picture Oscar for Do the Right Thing. In 1992, his Malcolm X biopic was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. In 2013, he released the Old Boy remake, so enough said. Actually, no, not enough said. Chirac in 2015 showed that he might be on the path back to greatness, but it was just nowhere near the levels of his early work. Number 2. Paul W.S. Anderson. There was a time, not so very long ago, when Paul W.S. Anderson was the man studios would turn to when they were about to embark on an adaptation of a video game or a risky sci-fi outing. Mortal Kombat, Event Horizon, Resident Evil, Alien vs Predator, they all made up the bulk of an impressive CV prior to 2004. Despite setting a delightfully trashy bar, the last 10 years have seen Anderson rooted in progressively worsening Resident Evil sequels and the occasional ill-fated attempts to reboot an old story. Death Race and The Three Musketeers both best watched through your hands. Anderson's steadily gone from being a director who made great bad films to one who just makes bad films, all in less than a decade. The problem is there's a genuine lack of the former at the moment, and if Anderson can pick the right next project, he could easily get back into the groove of making the next generation's guilty pleasures. Number 1, and I think by his own admission, Kevin Smith. After basically becoming the cinematic voice of an entire geek generation following the release of Clerks, Kevin Smith's Askew-universe of shared canon films took him from decent indie director to one of the most important filmmakers of the new millennium. Mallrats, Chasing Amy, Dogma, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, and Clerks 2 never quite lived up to his first outing, but were all excellent films in their own right. Since then, Smith's career only has Red State to point at as any sort of saving grace in a mire of bad comedies like Cop Out and Zack and Miri Make a Porno. Jersey Girl in particular, which starred longtime collaborator Ben Affleck and his then wife Jennifer Lopez, was so bland, insipid and formulaic that it more or less derailed Smith's credibility with his original audience. Smith's remained a huge part of the industry and an important voice in filmmaking, but his much talked about third Clerks installment remains mired in development hell some 21 years after the original. We might be getting a Jay and Silent Bob film instead, but whatever he does, he has to make it work if he's ever to recapture that former magic. So that's our list. Let us know what you thought by leaving a comment below, and as ever, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Until next time, I'm Adam from Whatculture.com, a formerly great voiceover artist who hasn't made anything good for years, and I'll see you soon.